There are moments in life that don't give you a warning. They don't tap you on the shoulder and say, "Pay attention, because this one is going to matter." They just arrive, quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, on a sidewalk you've walked 100 times, in front of strangers you'll never see again. And in those moments, something inside you comes out. Not the version of yourself you've carefully built for the world to see. Not the version that smiles in meetings and holds doors open when someone's watching. The real version. The one you keep buried under your achievements and your titles and your carefully curated image. The one that only surfaces when you think no one important is paying attention. Amara Collins had one of those moments on a Wednesday afternoon on a street in downtown Chicago. She said something she couldn't take back. And what happened after that, in the hours, the days, the weeks that followed, would shake her to her foundation in a way that no business failure, no public embarrassment, no financial loss ever had. Because the man she chose to humiliate that day wasn't just a stranger. He was a mirror. And Amara Collins was not prepared for what she saw. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. This community spans the entire world and we genuinely love knowing where you're watching from. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to that Wednesday. Let's go back to the beginning. Ask yourself something honest before we continue. Have you ever walked past a person sitting on the ground and looked right through them? Not looked away out of awkwardness. Not avoided eye contact out of guilt. But genuinely, truly, looked through them, the way you look through a piece of glass, as if they were not a full human being standing on the same earth as you? Most of us won't admit it. But most of us have done it. We've done it because somewhere along the way, without realizing it, we started organizing people. We started placing them into invisible categories, worthy and unworthy, important and unimportant, someone who matters and someone who doesn't. We do it in elevators and waiting rooms and airport lounges. We do it on the street. We decide in less than a second whether a person is worth our time, our eye contact, our basic human decency, and we do it based on nothing more than what they're wearing, how they smell, whether they look like someone we'd want to know. Amara Collins had mastered this. She had refined it into something almost automatic. Something she didn't even notice herself doing anymore. Until the day it cost her everything she hadn't realized she was still holding on to. Amara Collins was 38 years old, and she had the kind of life that people described with one word: impressive. She ran a mid-sized management consulting firm called Elevation Group, headquartered on the 14th floor of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. She had 12 full-time employees, a waiting list of corporate clients, and a reputation in her industry for being brilliant, efficient, and absolutely unforgiving of mediocrity. She drove a black Mercedes that she kept spotless. She owned a condo in the Gold Coast with a view of Lake Michigan that could make grown men go quiet the first time they saw it. Her suits were tailored. Her calendar was packed. Her voice, when she walked into a room, carried the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. To anyone looking at her life from the outside, Amara Collins had done it. She had won. But here is what people on the outside didn't know. Here is what the tailored suits and the corner office and the spotless Mercedes couldn't cover. Amara had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago with her mother, her younger brother Marcus, and a level of financial precarity that never fully left her nervous system, even decades later. Her mother, Patricia, worked double shifts as a hospital aide for most of Amara's childhood. There were months when the lights got cut off. There were Christmases that were held together by her mother's stubbornness and a credit card that never quite got paid down. Amara remembered standing in line at her middle school for free lunch and a girl whose name she had long since forgotten but whose face she still saw sometimes in dreams, had whispered something to the person next to her and laughed. Amara had not understood exactly what was said. But she had understood what it meant. It meant, you are less than. It meant, people like you belong at the bottom. And from that day forward, Amara Collins had made a promise to herself that was not about success, not really. It was about never standing in that line again. It was about never being laughed at again. It was about becoming the kind of person who could not be dismissed. The tragedy of that promise, and it was a tragedy, though Amara wouldn't understand that until much later, was that it worked. She had become exactly that person. Formidable, polished, impossible to dismiss. But in the process of running as far as she could from the girl in that lunch line, she had also left something behind. Something soft. Something that allowed for patience, for grace, for the simple human ability to see another person's dignity as equal to your own. She hadn't noticed it was gone. You rarely do. Her colleague, a woman named Denise who had worked alongside Amara for 6 years and was one of the few people Amara genuinely trusted, once said to her during a late night at the office, "You know what your problem is, Amara? You treat people like they're either assets or obstacles. There's no middle category for you." Amara had looked at her for a moment and then said, "That's because most of the time, that's exactly what they are." Denise had gone quiet after that. Not because she was defeated. Because she recognized that Amara believed it completely. Her personal life reflected this as well. She had been with a man named Thomas for 2 years, a kind, steady architect who brought her coffee exactly the way she liked it and remembered the names of all her clients. Thomas had ended things 8 months before the Wednesday in question. Not dramatically, not angrily. Just quietly, with sadness in his eyes, he had told her, "I feel like I've been auditioning for your life for 2 years and I still haven't gotten the part." Amara had sat with that for a moment and then asked him if he was taking the good coffee maker or the cheap one. It was the kind of response that protected her completely and revealed her completely at the same time. She had not cried about Thomas leaving. But she had started sleeping with the television on after he left, which she told herself was just a habit, and not anything else. The man's name was Raymond Elias. And if you had walked past him on the corner of Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue on any given morning in October, you would have done exactly what almost everyone did. You would have looked past him. He was in his early 60s, though he looked older in the way that a life spent mostly outdoors ages a person faster than the calendar suggests. He wore a faded army green jacket that was too big for him, the kind of jacket that had clearly been good quality once, maybe 20 years ago. His jeans were worn through at the knee. He had a gray beard, closely cropped on the sides, and eyes that were a very clear, very pale shade of brown, almost amber, that caught the light in a way you noticed if you were ever close enough, which most people weren't. He sat on the same stretch of sidewalk every day with a small cardboard sign that read simply, "Anything helps. God bless." He didn't call out to people. He didn't rattle a cup or make eye contact aggressively or tell dramatic stories to passers-by the way some people on that block did. He just sat. Quietly, with an almost unsettling stillness, watching the river of people move past him. Street vendors who worked that block said he'd been there for at least 2 years. A security guard named Pete, who worked the lobby of the building on the corner, used to bring him a cup of coffee from the shop inside on cold mornings. He told people that Raymond was polite, soft-spoken, and almost never talked about himself. Just about other people. "He always asked about my kids," Pete would say later. "Every single morning, he asked about my kids by name. Remembered every detail I ever told him. I thought that was unusual. Most people barely remember your name. Think about that for a second." Here was a man sitting on a cold Chicago sidewalk who remembered the names of a security guard's children. Who asked follow-up questions. Who paid attention. While the thousands of people walking past him every day, people with warm offices and full refrigerators and phones buzzing with notifications, couldn't spare 3 seconds to acknowledge he existed. Ask yourself, what does that say about who was actually paying attention to the world? What does that say about who was actually present? It was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of October, and the air in Chicago had that particular quality it gets in mid-autumn, sharp and clean and slightly raw, carrying the smell of the lake and dying leaves and roasting nuts from the cart on the corner. Amara had just finished a 45-minute call with a client who had spent 30 of those minutes arguing about a line item in a proposal that he had already approved in writing. She was walking to the deli 3 blocks away, the one she went to every Wednesday for her turkey club and iced coffee, and her jaw was tight and her heels were hitting the pavement a little harder than usual. She was on her phone, scrolling through emails with one hand, holding her bag with the other, moving fast through the lunchtime crowd the way she always did, like she was parting water, expecting everyone around her to simply adjust to her trajectory. Raymond was standing up. This was unusual. He rarely stood. But that morning, Pete had told him there were city contractors coming through to pressure wash the sidewalk in the afternoon, and he'd moved slightly to give them room to mark the section near where he usually sat. He was repositioning, shifting his weight, turning slightly, and that is when it happened. The collision was minor. Barely anything. His shoulder caught the edge of Amara's bag as she passed. The bag didn't fall. Its contents didn't spill. It swung, bumped against her hip, and that was all. Under normal circumstances, on a different day, with a different client call behind her, Amara might have just kept walking. But these were not those circumstances. She stopped. She turned around. And she looked at Raymond Elias with an expression that anyone who witnessed it would describe, consistently, as contempt. "Watch where you're going," she said. Her voice was sharp and flat, the tone she used in meetings when someone had wasted her time. Raymond looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm sorry about that," he said. His voice was calm. Measured. The kind of calm that comes not from being passive but from having made a choice. Amara looked him up and down, the faded jacket, the worn jeans, the cup on the ground, and something in her that should have been a boundary had no boundary at all. "You need to watch where you're standing," she said. "You're in the middle of a public sidewalk." "I know," he said simply. "I'm sorry. It should have ended there. Any reasonable reading of the moment says it should have ended there." But Amara was not, in that moment, operating from reason. She was operating from something older. Something from a lunch line in a middle school on the south side. Something that had been waiting, all these years, for a moment where it felt safe to come out and be cruel. "People like you," she said, loud enough now that 2 or 3 people near them slowed down, "don't have any sense of where you are or who's around you. This street isn't yours to sprawl across. You want to sit somewhere, go find a shelter." The crowd around them had shifted. 3 people had stopped entirely. A woman with a stroller had turned to look. 2 men eating food from paper bags had gone very still. Raymond Elias did not raise his voice. He did not step toward her. He did not, in any visible way, react with anger. He looked at Amara for a long, quiet moment. And then he said, very softly, "You shouldn't have said that." Not a threat. Not a curse. Not a retort. Just 5 words, delivered with a stillness that somehow landed heavier than shouting would have. Amara stared at him for a moment. Then she made a dismissive sound, turned, and walked away. She did not look back. She ordered her turkey club. She drank her iced coffee. She went back to the office and sent 17 emails and took 2 more calls and told herself, by the time she was in her car at 6:30 that evening, that the whole thing had been nothing. Just a blip. An irritating Wednesday. Nothing at all. If you're still watching this right now, comment the words, "I'm still here," down below, because what happens next is the part of this story that most people cannot explain. The first thing she noticed was her phone. 40 minutes after she got back to the office, it started behaving strangely. Not dramatically, not in a movie way, just small, persistent wrongness. Calls that connected and then immediately dropped. A voicemail from a client she hadn't spoken to in 3 months that showed up in her inbox time-stamped from that afternoon, but when she listened to it, it was a message he had left her over a year ago. Her assistant, a young man named Jordan who was meticulous and reliable, came in to tell her that the conference room booking system had somehow double-scheduled her most important client presentation for the following Tuesday, the same slot she had specifically told Jordan to protect for 3 weeks. She told him to fix it. He came back 20 minutes later, confused, to tell her that the system was showing the original booking had been entered under her name, from her own computer, at 12:47 that afternoon. Amara had not been in the office at 12:47. She had been at the deli. She did not know what to make of that. She told Jordan to just call the client and reschedule, and she closed her office door and sat with a feeling she could not name. It was not quite anxiety. It was something more specific than that. The feeling you get when you know something is slightly wrong but you can't locate exactly what. She left the office at 6:30, took the elevator to the parking garage, put her key in the car, and the car did not start. The engine turned over once, weakly, and then went quiet. She tried again. Nothing. This was a Mercedes she had purchased 14 months ago. It had never once given her trouble. She sat in the silent parking garage for a moment, listening to the hum of the ventilation system, and felt, for no reason she could articulate, the urge to look over her shoulder. She called a car service, waited 22 minutes in the cold lobby of the parking garage, and rode home in the back of a black Suburban in a mood she couldn't shake. She ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter, leftover pasta, barely heated, and stood at her floor-to-ceiling window watching the lights on the lake for a long time before she went to bed. She left the television on. She always did, since Thomas left. But that night, even the television felt thin. Even the noise of it couldn't fill the space. She saw Raymond again on Thursday morning. She was in the back of another car service, her Mercedes was in the shop, the mechanic on the phone saying something about an electrical fault he'd never seen before in that model, and they were stopped at a red light on Michigan Avenue, right at the corner where Raymond usually sat. She almost didn't look. But something made her turn her head toward the window. He was standing at the curb, not sitting. And he was looking directly at her car. Not at the car in general, at the window she was sitting behind. At her. The light was tinted. There was no logical way he could have known she was in that car. And yet the certainty with which he was looking at that exact window, at that exact moment, sent something cold and electric from the base of her neck straight down her spine. The light changed. The car moved. She kept her eyes forward and told herself it was a coincidence. She was a rational person. She ran a consulting firm. She believed in data and logic and evidence. It was a coincidence. She believed that until Friday. Friday morning, she arrived at the office to find that one of her longest-standing clients, a regional bank that had been with Elevation Group for 4 years and accounted for roughly 18% of the firm's annual revenue, had sent a letter by courier. Not an email. A physical letter, with a signature at the bottom. Thanking her for the years of service. Informing her that they were taking their business in a different direction. Effective immediately. No prior warning. No conversation. No phone call she had missed. Just a letter, arriving on a Friday morning, informing her that 18% of her income had simply walked out of her life. Amara sat in her chair with that letter for a very long time. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time since she was a girl in a lunch line on the South Side, she felt something she did not have an adequate defense against. She felt afraid. She did not tell anyone. That was the Amara Collins way, you did not show the wound until you had already healed it. She told Jordan to hold all calls, closed herself in her office, and spent 2 hours on the phone with her attorney and her financial advisor going through the numbers, looking for angles, trying to understand if there was a legal angle on the client termination or a financial backstop she hadn't considered. There wasn't. The client had been within their rights. The contract had an exit clause. The attorney was sorry. The financial advisor reminded her that the firm was still healthy, that 18% was painful but not fatal, and suggested she spend the weekend away from work. She hung up and sat with the silence of her office and the city visible through the window below her, all of it going about its business without any awareness that her world had just cracked slightly down the middle. And then she thought about Raymond Elias. She did not want to think about him. She actively pushed the thought away. But it came back. It came back with his voice. "You shouldn't have said that." She thought, "That's crazy. That is genuinely crazy thinking. A man sitting on a sidewalk did not cause your client to leave. A man sitting on a sidewalk did not cause your car's electrical system to fail. A man sitting on a sidewalk has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. These things happen. Business is uncertain. Cars break down." She was a rational person. She believed in data. She went home, poured herself a glass of wine she barely touched, and tried to read a book she couldn't concentrate on, and when she finally fell asleep at midnight, she dreamed about the lunch line at her middle school, and the girl laughing, and the sound of it was not the girl's voice at all. It was her own. She went back to that corner on Saturday morning. She told herself she was just going for a walk. She walked 2 miles in the wrong direction first, as though creating plausible deniability with herself, and then she came around and walked the last 4 blocks to Michigan Avenue and stood on the far side of the street and watched the corner where Raymond usually sat. He was there. Sitting, this time, with his back against the wall and his legs crossed at the ankle and that extraordinary stillness he always had, like a man who had made peace with something most people spend their whole lives running from. Amara watched him for a few minutes from across the street. She noticed that in the span of those few minutes, 3 separate people stopped and spoke to him. A young woman who left a bag of food. An older man in a North Face jacket who crouched down and shook Raymond's hand like they were old friends. A kid, maybe 12 years old, who ran ahead of his mother, dropped something into Raymond's cup, and ran back. Raymond smiled at each of them. And here is the thing that struck Amara, standing across that street in her Saturday clothes with her heart beating strangely in her chest, the smile was not the smile of a man performing gratitude for strangers. It was the smile of a man who genuinely recognized each of those people. Who saw them. Who had been paying attention long enough to know, in some real way, who they were. Amara crossed the street. She stood in front of him for a moment without speaking. Raymond looked up. He showed no surprise. "I thought you'd come back," he said. She sat down on the edge of the low concrete wall nearby. She didn't know why she sat down. She almost never sat down in public, it felt to her like a form of vulnerability, being at eye level with everyone walking past. But she sat down, and she looked at him, and she said, "What did you mean the other day? What you said? What did you mean by that?" Raymond looked at her for a moment. He didn't answer right away. He had the quality, she was noticing, of someone who thought about what they were going to say before they said it, which is rarer than it sounds. "I meant what I said," he told her. "That's all. What you said to me was unkind. And you knew it was unkind when you said it. And I think you knew, on some level, that there was a cost to that." "What kind of cost?" she asked, and she heard something in her own voice she didn't expect, not aggression, not her professional armor. Just the plain, unguarded question of someone who actually wanted to know. "I don't mean a supernatural cost," he said carefully. "I don't mean I have any kind of power over your life, because I don't. But there's a cost that's internal. There's something that happens inside you when you treat another person as though they're less than you are. Something shifts. It doesn't shift back easily." She stared at him. "How do you know about my week?" she asked, and then she stopped herself, because that was an absurd question, she hadn't told him about her week. But she had said it, and it was out there between them, and Raymond didn't look surprised by it either. "I don't know about your week," he said. "But I know about the kind of week that follows the kind of moment you had on Wednesday. I've had that moment myself. From both sides." She looked at him differently then. She looked at him the way you look at something when you've finally decided to actually look at it instead of past it. And she asked a question she had not planned to ask. "What happened to you?" Raymond was quiet for a long moment. The city moved around them, buses and heels and a distant siren. A gust off the lake made her pull her jacket tighter. And Raymond Elias told her something that she would carry for the rest of her life. He told her that he had not always been here. That he had spent 22 years as an operations manager for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Indianapolis. That he had a daughter named Christine and a son named Aaron and a house with a yard where he had grown tomatoes every summer because his own father had grown tomatoes, and it was the one ritual that made him feel like a continuous human being rather than a collection of job titles. That his wife, a woman named Donna, had gotten sick in 2017, a kind of sick that takes a long time and costs a tremendous amount of money and leaves a person watching someone they love become a stranger in their own body. That he had used every resource, every savings account, every borrowed favor trying to help her. That Donna had passed away in February of 2019, and that the grief of it had done something to him that he had not been equipped to recover from quickly. That he had lost the job 9 months later, not fired, but laid off in a restructuring, the kind of cold, numerical decision that companies make without any awareness of the human life it lands on. That the house had followed, and then the car, and then the careful structure of a life he had built over decades had simply come apart, piece by piece, the way things do when the central thing holding them together is suddenly gone. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," he said. "I just want you to know that a month before I ended up on this corner, I was a man with a pension and a garden and a daughter who called me every Sunday. Nobody looked at me the way you looked at me on Wednesday. And then one day, they did. And I want you to understand what that looks like from this side." The city kept moving around them. Amara Collins sat very still. And somewhere in her chest, something that had been held rigid for a very long time began, slowly and painfully, to give way. "How are you feeling right now, watching this? Because we need to stop for just 1 second and ask you, does Raymond's story feel familiar to you? Have you ever known someone who had everything and then lost it, not through any failure of character or strength, but through the random, brutal weight of circumstances no one plans for? Or maybe, and this takes courage to admit, have you ever been Amara? Have you ever looked at someone in a difficult situation and felt, even for a moment, that somehow they had deserved it? That people who were struggling because of some flaw in themselves? Be honest with yourself. Because this story is asking you to be honest with yourself. 6 weeks after that Saturday morning conversation, something happened that Amara Collins would later describe as the most disorienting experience of her professional life. She received a phone call from a man named Gerald Whitfield, who was the chief operations officer of a regional manufacturing consortium in the Midwest, one of the largest potential clients Elevation Group had ever had the possibility of working with, the kind of account that would not just replace the business she had lost but expand it significantly. Gerald Whitfield told her that he had been referred to her firm by someone whose judgment he trusted implicitly. Amara asked who had referred her. Gerald said the man's name was Raymond Elias. Amara went so quiet on the phone that Gerald asked if she was still there. "Raymond Elias," she said, carefully, "is a man who sits on a corner on Michigan Avenue." "He used to," Gerald said. "Raymond was my operations manager for 11 years before life dealt him a difficult hand. He is one of the most competent and decent men I have ever known. And he told me 2 weeks ago that he had met a consultant who had a sharp mind and the kind of potential that was worth paying attention to. He mentioned your firm by name." Amara sat at her desk and looked out at the lake through her floor-to-ceiling window. "He referred you to me," she said. "He referred me to you," Gerald confirmed. She went back to the corner that same afternoon. She had a check in her coat pocket, not a small amount, along with the name of a housing resource coordinator that her attorney had pulled together. It was a cold afternoon, the sky low and gray the way Chicago gets in early December, and she walked fast because she did not want to lose her nerve. Raymond was not on the corner. She waited 20 minutes, walking back and forth in front of the building, hands in her pockets, breath making small clouds in the air. Pete, the security guard, came out and recognized her. He had seen her there before, and told her that Raymond had found temporary housing 2 weeks ago. A program on the west side that a social worker had connected him with after someone had apparently advocated on his behalf. He didn't know who. He gave her the address of the organization. She went that same evening. She left the envelope with the coordinator at the front desk with Raymond's name on it and drove home in the dark and sat at her kitchen window for a long time without turning on the television. The silence didn't feel empty this time. It felt like the beginning of something. 4 months later, Amara Collins launched a partnership between Elevation Group and a Chicago-based workforce reintegration nonprofit. The partnership was designed specifically to provide consulting services to individuals who had been displaced from professional careers by illness, family crisis, or economic disruption, people who, in her words at the launch event, had the skills and the will but had been made invisible by circumstances none of us are immune to. The Gerald Whitfield account came through. It was, as projected, the largest single contract in Elevation Group's history. But Amara would tell anyone who asked that the most significant business decision she had ever made was not signing that contract. It was sitting down on a concrete wall on a Saturday morning and asking a man on a sidewalk what had happened to him. The most significant professional skill she ever developed was not a consulting framework or a negotiation technique. It was the decision to actually look at another person. To see them as complete, as whole, as worthy of the same attention she demanded for herself. Raymond Elias, as of the following spring, was employed again, a consultant role with a small operations firm that Gerald Whitfield had recommended him to directly. He moved into a small apartment on the north side. He started calling his daughter Christine on Sundays again. He grew a small pot of tomatoes on his apartment windowsill because some rituals are too important to give up, no matter how much the circumstances around them change. The two of them never became close friends. That's not how this story ends. Life is not a movie, and not every encounter that changes you turns into a relationship. But they did have coffee together once, in the spring, at a shop 2 blocks from where they first met. And Amara asked him something she had been thinking about for months. She asked, "That day, when I said what I said to you, were you angry?" Raymond thought about it for a moment. "I was tired," he said finally. "I'd been tired for a long time. And I remember thinking, this woman is terrified of something. She's not angry at me. She doesn't even see me. She's angry at whatever I represent to her. Whatever I remind her of." Amara looked at her coffee cup. "You were right," she said. He nodded. "I know," he said. "But here's the thing. That's true of almost everyone who's ever cruel to a stranger. They're not really talking to you. They're talking to the version of their life they're most afraid of." They sat with that for a while, the way you sit with something that is both painful and useful. And then Raymond said, "The question isn't whether you were that person on a Wednesday in October. The question is who you decide to be on every Wednesday after it. So let us ask you, before we close this story. If this had been your Wednesday, if you had been the one on that sidewalk, armed with contempt you didn't even fully understand, what do you think would have happened? Would you have gone back? Would you have sat down? Would you have asked? And on the other side of it, if you had been Raymond, carrying loss that most people never have to carry, sitting in plain sight while the world walked through you like glass, what would that have done to you? Would you have had his stillness? His patience? His ability to say, simply and without rage, "You shouldn't have said that"? We think about the Amaras in this world more than we think about the Raymonds. We tell stories about the people who were humbled. But the real story, the story worth sitting with, is about the Raymond Eliases. The ones who carry dignity in conditions designed to take it from them. The ones who absorb the worst of what we become in our worst moments and somehow, instead of letting it destroy them, let it speak. Because sometimes the person we look past on the sidewalk is not just a person in need. Sometimes they are the clearest mirror we will ever be offered. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, and very brave, we are paying enough attention to look. What did this story make you feel? Tell us honestly in the comments. Did Amara's transformation feel earned to you? And what about Raymond? Do you think most people would have responded to that humiliation with his kind of grace? Or would you have reacted differently? If you've ever had a moment like Amara's, a moment you wish you could take back, know that you're not alone in that. And know that the door that Raymond walked through is the same one that's open for anyone willing to sit down and ask. If this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting for you right here. Subscribe so you never miss it. And wherever you're watching from tonight, we see you.